Well, hello, Facebook Live and YouTube. Welcome to our next episode of Face to Face with Racism. I'm Jeffrey Moore.
And I'm Heather Gratis.
And we're pastors at St. Stephen United Methodist Church in Mesquite. Today we're talking about mass incarceration and how that functions as a covert form of racism and white supremacy. And we have two experts with us today who have a wealth of knowledge. And so I don't want to delay anymore, but jump right into our conversation. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So we'll start with Richard Thomas. Richard, would you introduce yourself to us and give us perhaps some introductory thoughts or comments?
Sure. Hey, everybody. Very good to be here. It's always good to be able to talk about these issues critically with folks. My name is Richard. People call me Rich. I use he, him pronouns. I have a master's degree in divinity and another master's in theology and history, both from Bright Divinity School. Shout out to all my Bright peeps. For the context of this, I typically, I've organized around prison-related issues for around the past 5 years or so. And even before then, thinking about the issues of something that I call not the criminal justice system, but the criminal punishment system, and looking at that in relation to not only Black and brown folk, but all marginalized communities, and how the punitive nature of that system is not only a reflection of like what is professed as American values, but even more specifically, if we talk about a religious context and Christianity more specifically, it's a reflection of those Christian values, which is kind of like my impetus in terms of being involved in work regarding like for me, prison abolition, which I'm happy to speak to a little later, but also more broadly issues on transforming the criminal punishment system. So for me, it's not just a issue of like religious and spiritual importance, which it is, but it's also about like the way people relate to each other in the most basic and fundamental ways. So that's kind of like a very brief introduction. Happy to hear whatever other thoughts and questions people may have about that as well too.
Well, thank you. We will forgive you the bright orientation, since Ben, Heather, and I are all SMU ponies. But we welcome you into our space. I wonder, before we go to Ben, can you say a little bit more about this, what may be for some provocative distinction between criminal justice and criminal punishment system?
Ooh, good question. Y'all already got me excited, and it's 4:04. Yeah. So the reason why I say criminal punishment system as opposed to justice is because justice has a very specific connotation to it. Justice has a meaning of like repairing harm, and it has a meaning of like seeking, and it's about rectifying on multiple ends about something that's happened. The reason why I call it the criminal punishment system is because the current system regarding American laws and standards, and also it's a global phenomenon too, it doesn't serve any of those purposes. The only purpose that it fulfills currently is that punishment aspect. And like the easy way to look at that is through something that criminal justice scholars call recidivism rates, which is the rate at which people return back to prison and things like that. If the system really worked, that wouldn't be an issue, because the cause people would have quote unquote served their time, or people would have like made amends for their harm, and thus like justice would have been served. But since that happened, the only thing we actually see is the punishment aspect of it. So that's kind of like a very brief introduction to that, but it also goes several deeper layers as well.
So I appreciate that. We've talked a lot about this at St. Stephen, that justice as a biblical concept is about restoration. It's about right relationship, restored relationship. It's about living into the fullness of what God created us to be, and restoring each individual to that path. I wish that I had a big sort of sarcasm stamp I could put on the broadcast, but what I hear you saying is that our criminal justice system doesn't do that. Okay, 2 thumbs up on that. Okay, I am sure we'll be coming back to that more or digging deeper into it. Ben, would you introduce yourself to us and offer us some introductory framing thoughts on mass incarceration as a covert form of racism?
Sure. Yep. My name is Ben, as you all have already heard, and I come into this work from a number of different pathways. Pronouns he, him, by the way. And like Jeffrey already said, we were colleagues at Southern Methodist University in the religious studies PhD program. So that's one of the contexts in which I come at this work from. Is I have a background in the PhD from Southern Methodist, and I did my divinity school work at Duke Divinity School. But
Also,
the focus of my studies in both of those places was on the relationship between Christianity, both historical, political, theoretical, theological, the relationship between Christianity and white supremacy, colonialism, and in particular, I began to focus much more on the criminal punishment system, as Richard just identified or named how the legal system works. I also refer to it as a criminal punishment system for, in many ways, the same reasons that Richard already lifted up. And I think for me, one of the things that's been really important as well is in terms of the coming at this work out of the study angle has been the way in which a certain Christian theologic of carcerality, of capture, of enclosure has helped very much produce this mass system of containment and control. And I think when you look at the history here as well, the aspect of covert racism and mass incarceration as being an outcome of covert racism, if we really just situate mass incarceration in the broader historical political context, it's really just overt racism. And we can obviously talk about that more. But the other angle that I come into this with is I'm currently an organizer. And I organize with Faith in Texas. And in particular, my organizing work there, I'm in a direct relationship with people who have either been incarcerated, so that are currently incarcerated, formerly incarcerated, or are directly impacted by the criminal punishment system. And so I'm in deep relationship with people who have been harmed by this system, who have been finding ways to resist this system and survive in the midst of the harm that it causes. As you can hear, Beasley, my dog, is agreeing with me on all of that right now. So yeah, those are kind of the two contexts in which both the academic context in which I come at these matters, and then also for me right now, the organizing has really shaped how I both understand what the criminal punishment system does and exists to do, but also the real life impact of it and how we could strategically intervene to really scale and roll it back and invest in real kind forms of safety. And we can get into all those things as well. So that's kind of the broader, or those are just some introductory thoughts about who I am, where I'm coming into this work from, and this question about the relationship between racism and mass incarceration.
Okay, so I want to get, before we get back to Richard, because I saw a couple thumbs up there, and I want to give him a chance to step in. Can you just for a moment unpack? You had a really dense statement there about incarceration as an outworking of a Christian concept of encapsulation and capture, and can you put that like on an undergraduate level for us instead of, or maybe even like a senior in high school? Yeah.
Yes.
There's a lot there that I think would be really helpful for folks.
Yes, I think there are a lot of obviously layers and dimensions to that. One of the more actually, it's a colleague of mine, James Hill Jr. said to me once that one of the ways in which people think about, in which Christians have learned to imagine hell, is God as basically a warden of a cosmic prison. And that really, I think that some of the ways in which, the theological ways in which we have learned to understand hell and sin and consequences for sin being tied up with these forms of trauma and punishment, and God again as being this warden over a cosmic prison, that there are these sorts of underlying theological logics that have really helped Christians get really committed to punishment. And so our theologies have really endorsed punishment, and it can be hard then to sort of to begin to put those two things apart. And it's not only then, of course, that the theologies have endorsed punishment, but the way in which Christianity has just been practiced in the real world. If you look at it in terms of what does Christianity do in the world, and what Christianity has done in the world for the last, it's done a lot of different things, but one of the things that Christianity has done in the world for the last 600 years is it has been really bound up with the different projects of displacing people, and then containing the people. So in colonialism, for example, and then containing those people within, whether it be quite literal cages or camps. I mean, I think we can look at the ways in which those explicit expressions of containment and enclosure that are really kind of, that are both ways in which Christianity just practiced itself, actually has been a thing in the world, and then has had this certain theological logic that gets bound up with it as well.
Yeah, this is not along the same line, but when you said that, I'm wondering what our friend Silver Nez Perry, who is a Navajo, would think about the idea of containment and enclosure in terms of Native American persons.
Yeah.
You know, we call it a reservation. They might call it a prison in many ways. It seems to me, and I want to bounce back to Richard, but I love your image, Ben, of God as warden of a cosmic prison. Although it seems to me that in the best American fashion, God has outsourced the warden business to the devil,
Right.
Which allows God to sit in this supposedly unbiased, clean position of judge, right? So God simply judges according to an unbiased law, and then sends people to the cosmic prison, which then the devil, who's not God, overseas, so that God doesn't have to get God's hands dirty. So this actually brings me, Richard, to something. I saw you do a thumbs up when Ben said that this wasn't covert racism, it was overt racism. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, because I know some of our people have to be out there saying, well, wait a minute. I mean, isn't this just justice? I mean, like, we have laws, we set up laws. This is how society has to work. And you break the law, and there have to be consequences of breaking the law. I mean, we set up chores for our kids. That's how a household has to work. And when the chores don't get done, then, you lose internet. I mean, that's just how it has to work, right? There's no other way. So how could this possibly be racist?
That is a very good question. I'll also apologize. Like Ben knows this. I'm a very expressive person, so whenever like I'm talking or communicating, like you'll see me do hand signs or you see me make facial expressions. So I definitely apologize for that too. But to your question, Ben did bring up a phenomenal point. What we typically think as like covert racism, something that happens incidentally, it's actually something that happens on purpose. And like for a full, like, or not a full, but a really decent picture of what that can look like, I highly recommend everyone, if they haven't seen it yet, to watch the documentary 13th. It came out a couple of years ago, and it has a lot of phenomenal people who are speaking on this topic particularly. And a couple key points from that kind of stick out to me to speak to both the carcerality and to this idea of like it actually being overt or it actually being something very blatant and not necessarily just something that happens by accident. First is that the United States incarcerates at a rate at unimaginable numbers. We make up 5% of the world's global population, yet we have 25% of the world's prison population. So that immediately sets the context for how the prison system works. So then now we take that first line and then also bring it into the conversation. We can bring it back into both Christianity and the historical advent of slavery and the things that came after slavery to understand why the prison system is the way that it is. And for me, and lots of other scholars who kind of thought through some of these questions, the primary purpose of prisons, slavery, and all those features have been economic. It wasn't necessarily white supremacy isn't just about like thinking of one group that's superior to another group or race. There's also very much invested economic interest in the exploitation of people and labor. And we not only see that in the historical context of slavery in the past, we also can trace that trajectory to what is prison labor used for in the 21st century and even historically, not just the 21st century. So I would say all that is to say that the gross disparities between what we classify as crime, which is go a little sociological for a second, which is something that's completely socially constructed because when we think of crime, we think, okay, oh, that's obviously a bad action that someone commit. But obviously there's some laws in some group of people who define what that means. And the best or one of the like best examples for that is thinking about like crack cocaine laws of the early 1990s and 80s and 90s, and then the three strike laws again in the 90s. Different things like that specifically targeted African American communities. The war on drugs, another example of that. These things that don't mention Black and brown folks by name, but also explicitly target them. And like, again, why I mentioned the documentary 13 is because it really does a good idea. It does a really good job of laying out that foundation and exploring how Black and brown folks became criminalized, not simply just through laws and policy, but even in rhetoric and through overrepresentation of crime in like in popular culture. Like, if you think for a second, if you ever watched the show Cops, like I remember being a kid watching the show Cops, and all you see are Black and brown people who are getting arrested or committing crime. That gives a false perception, of what crime is, because there's so much emphasis on this like physical harm and this physical crime of robbing somebody or doing drugs and stuff. So it does that in one sense, but at the same time, it also allows people to internalize this understanding of like this group of people or this culture that's bad, or even that it's cultural. The whole idea that like Black culture has a criminal element to it that all comes from racist ideas about what is crime and what is behavior. So that's kind of like the simple. I know I just said a ton with that, and happy to stop for a second and like allow some breaking down of all that, but that's a pretty big topic.
That's all right. The nice thing about the broadcast is people can go back and watch them again, and hit pause if they want to and review. I want to push on to a couple questions that have come up in the comments. One is, we'll return to some of these ideas later, but one is, how does the for-profit prison system drive mass incarceration? Or perhaps does the for-profit prison system help drive mass incarceration?
I would like to correct that. It's not
I'm sorry.
the for-profit prison system. It's the entire prison system. And that's an important distinction to make.
Okay.
For a long time, I was like against the privatization of prisons, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're against all prisons. But one of the things that I came to learn about as I started reading and learning more about what drives the entire prison system, like I said, the simple analogy is to like go back and like trace it to slavery. But for the context right here, I can break it down way simpler than that. We can break it down to say the prison system, oftentimes both public and private prisons, they've been outsourced to both the state and private industries like Core Civic and other groups that make enormous profits off having people inside those facilities. But it's not just that they make profit off having people inside those facilities. They make enormous profit off the communications, all the different ways they like all the different levels of communication, even the specific labor that incarcerated folks do. Like y'all might have heard about the wildfires in California, incarcerated folks are bearing the brunt of that. And you might have heard a lie that's giving them skills and trains that they can use once they get out. But the reality is, like, once they get out, they don't get like an actual license or certification and whatever is necessary to have that in the outside world. They're simply considered volunteers. So the experience that they would get from that has no meaning for them once they're in the outside world. So like that's kind of part of it. And there's also just like the very basic idea of prison labor is a way of outsourcing stuff that basic products like license plates and tags like that on cars and stuff. Those are very real and easy ways to outsource labor to prison. And all the prisons stay open based on the amount of cells that are filled. So whether it's a private prison, state or locally owned prison, all those are only allowed to stay open based on the amount of number of people that are in there. So based on that, there's a vested interest in getting more people inside those facilities, no matter like who's constructing it.
So what I hear you saying is that while we can't dismiss it as contributing to the problem,
I will say this: private prisons are much worse, though. Too, they exacerbate one of the same problems that exist in all prisons. I will say that's for sure too.
Right. They certainly exacerbate the problem, but a hyper focus on the for-profit prison system misses a more fundamental issue, which we need to unpack, which is the idea of imprisonment itself.
Correct.
Okay. I'm going to say let's hold that for our backstage conversation because we're almost out of time now. Which seems impossible, but here we are.
So fast.
John also asked a question about piggybacking on our last session. Our last session was actually, gentlemen, about the school to prison pipeline. And I don't know if either of you have any knowledge or expertise, but he was asking if that also drives mass incarceration.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. That's a very, very good point. Like in my day job, when I'm not doing organizing, I also work as a high school teacher at an alternative high school. So like the school to prison pipeline is something that's very close to what I do. Like, and the way that the school to prison pipeline relates to mass incarceration is that at the very simplest level, it criminalizes Black and brown folks at a really early age. And that's primarily through stuff like zero tolerance policies. So let's say a Black kid, like what's happened in my school, if a Black kid gets caught with, or Black and brown kids, or anybody really, but like specifically for this context, Black and brown kids get caught with drugs and something at school. Zero tolerance policy would kick them out. So once they're kicked out of school, then they're exposed to the streets. But also, it's not just that. Research shows that early contact with policing often creates especially in Black and brown communities, it creates a more negative perception of policing. So even at an early age, these folks who have this early exposure to policing through, having school resource officers in schools, also through policies like zero tolerance policies, that already funnels them into the system. And it doesn't just funnel them into the system, it creates this idea of criminalization of those folks. Because then, like, again, sociology, like labeling theory, I get into all sorts of details about like the sociology behind how Black and brown kids are criminalized directly through the school system, and also access to resources that would prevent these students from flourishing in that environment. So then, not only do they have these underfunded resources, but they also feel as if they have nowhere else to turn besides the things that are criminalized, right? And that's kind of like a very basic. I feel bad that I'm underselling the truth, like the enormity of like how complex this actually is, but I do want to like save space for other stuff too. But yeah, that's kind of the simple.
Thank you. Ben, you want to offer any thoughts before we have to sign off?
Yeah, the simple answers. I think at least one thing that may be useful for folks to is in part that the era of mass incarceration, like the context, right, in which, if we're talking about how is it that mass incarceration could be racist, and obviously now we've already started to talk about ways in which it is in fact racist by design, but the era of mass incarceration really spans the last 40-ish or so years, which is the same as the what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls the era of organized abandonment, where cities and states and the federal government have disinvested in social services and invested in police and prisons. And so there were two crises, and just to name the two crises real quick before we go, is that one, right, is coming out of the 60s and the 70s, is all of a sudden Black people have the right to vote and are being granted formal citizenship rights that incarceration, especially when you have a felony, strips away. There was also deindustrialization. So you had working class jobs going away, and you had a racial crisis at the same time. That the mass incarceration, in many ways, was the solution for the political and economic system that provided a lot of jobs, right? Prisons, the expansion of prisons. So you expanded from around 300,000 prison population to today we have 2.3 million in 40 years. That's a lot. And there's a lot of details and layers in that. But that's one thing as far as the context, I think, if you want to understand that there are crises that mass incarceration is solving so that the status quo can continue.
Wow.
Wow.
Well said.
So I want to just lift up some key things that I've heard here today. One, we're sort of working backwards. When we talk about mass incarceration, we really are talking about mass. Those figures you just gave us, from 300,000 to 1.3 million.
Hey, can I say something else about mass incarceration, though, just for the context part of it?
Yeah.
The other part about mass incarceration it's important to understand is that we're not just talking about people who are locked up. We're also talking about the system of surveillance. People on probation, parole, people who are part of the system as part of mass incarceration. That's it.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a helpful distinction. And I think important, obviously, because once you're in the system, right, it's very hard to get out of the system. I mean, I'm amazed that anyone would even imagine suggesting that skills that incarcerated persons are gaining on the fire lines would actually translate into employment. Because I cannot imagine that someone who has been incarcerated would pass a background check for any sort of public service job in that sector. I mean, that's just asinine to me. So we're talking about not just the prison system, but the whole criminal punishment system, as you described it. That's one key. And then the idea of what we criminalize, I think this is going to be hard for people to wrap their minds around. There are other ways to conceive of what is criminalized. Folks, you just have to spend a little bit of time in another culture to know that's true. But just take, for example, I mean, this is going to be a really low-level example, the legalization of marijuana.
Correct.
Right? We can choose to criminalize this or not. And the choice to criminalize it or any other number of things is part of what creates this system and creates a racially biased system. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, and it's not just about it's not just about choosing which to criminalize and which doesn't. It's about once you choose to criminalize something, who gets prosecuted for that exact same thing. Because even with crack cocaine laws, like I briefly delved into it, but 90s crack cocaine, the exact same substance, you would get a different sentence for crack compared to the harder substance of crack cocaine. And that's all racially based. Crack, the hard substance, is used in it's used in poor communities of color. Whereas the cocaine, it's kind of it's used by wealthier people. So just to, even with something, it's just the disparate sentences between those two things. One, you get a max of 5 years. The other, you get 25 to life for. And those things were done intentionally.
Mm-hmm. Okay. It seemed there was a third point I wanted to circle back to, but I can't remember what it is now. So we have lots to think about and much more to unpack. So I want to encourage you to tune in on Tuesday when our backstage episode will drop.
This is a lot, friends. I think that this one is especially difficult for us because most of us don't have a personal or intimate understanding of what the prison system or the criminal punishment system is like. And so we very happily allow it to happen in the background of our life and don't pay attention to what's going on. And so I think that as you think about these things and you research these things, because I know some of you are avid Googlers, be careful, be gentle, and give yourself grace as we learn what it means for us as Christians and as the people of St. Stephen to be anti-racist. We look forward to seeing you next week.
Next week when we discuss bail reform.
Bail reform.
So it'll be a continuation of our discussion this week. But I also want to lift up to you, one of the questions that John asked was, what can we ordinary folk do? This is a question that Cynthia often asks for us in our podcast. And I think that both of our guests, I don't want to speak for them, but I'm guessing that both of our guests would say, one of the things you can do is reach out to Faith in Texas and connect with Ben and the work that they're doing there, or reach out to Fight Toxic Prisons.
Correct.
And connect with the work that Rich is doing there. And I'm sure that you can find both of those organizations online. Is that correct?
Yep.
Correct.
You can.
All right.
Absolutely.
So we thank you for your attention this afternoon. And we thank both of our guests, Ben and Rich, for being with us. Look for our next episode to drop on Tuesday afternoon when we continue our conversation.